They called him Crash behind his back. The kid who couldn't tie his boots right, who stumbled through basic training, who got airsick during his first flight simulation. The instructors shook their heads. His fellow cadets snickered when he walked by. Even his own family wondered if he'd chosen the wrong path. But sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of humor about who it chooses to become a hero. Sometimes the person everyone counts out is exactly the one who'll save everyone else when the chips are down. This is the story of Marcus Ghost Rodriguez, the pilot nobody believed in, until the day America needed him most. The morning sun painted the Nevada desert in shades of gold and amber as Marcus Rodriguez stood outside the gates of Nellis Air Force Base, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder and his dreams weighing heavy on the other. At 19 years old, he looked more like a college freshman than someone about to begin one of the most demanding training programs in the world. His slight frame, barely meeting the minimum height requirements, had already earned him sideways glances from the other recruits gathering nearby. Marcus had grown up in a small town outside Albuquerque, where the biggest excitement was Friday night football games and the annual county fair. His father worked construction, his mother cleaned houses, and nobody in his family had ever worn a military uniform, let alone dreamed of flying fighter jets. But Marcus had always been different. While other kids played video games, he built model airplanes. While they watched cartoons, he studied aviation magazines he'd found at the library. The sky called to him in a way he couldn't explain. The path here hadn't been easy. His high school grades were decent, but not exceptional. His SAT scores were good enough to get into a state college, but nothing that would turn heads at the Air Force Academy. When he'd announced his intention to enlist and pursue pilot training, his guidance counselor had gently suggested he consider more realistic options. His parents, while supportive, couldn't hide their worry. Flying was for rich kids, academy graduates, people with connections, not for the son of a construction worker from New Mexico. But Marcus had something that couldn't be measured on standardized tests or seen in recommendation letters. He had an absolute, unwavering belief that he belonged in the cockpit of a fighter jet. It wasn't arrogance or delusion. It was something deeper, a certainty that lived in his bones. When he closed his eyes, he could feel the G-forces pressing against his chest, could see the earth falling away beneath him, could hear the roar of jet engines responding to his commands. The first few weeks of basic training nearly broke that certainty. Marcus struggled with everything his instructors threw at him. His push-ups were sloppy, his marching was out of step, and he couldn't seem to master the military bearing that came naturally to other recruits. During physical training, he consistently finished in the bottom quarter of his flight. The drill instructors, sensing weakness, made him their favorite target. Rodriguez, Sergeant Mills would bark across the training yard. Did you forget how to walk like a human being, or are you practicing your impression of a newborn colt? The other recruits would snicker, grateful that the heat was on someone else for a moment. Marcus learned to keep his eyes forward and his mouth shut, but inside, doubt began to creep in like poison. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe he didn't belong here. The nickname Crash started during his third week of training. During a seemingly simple obstacle course run, Marcus had been pushing himself to keep up with the faster recruits. As he approached the rope climb, his boots slipped on the wooden platform, sending him tumbling backward into the mud pit below. The impact knocked the wind out of him and covered him head to toe in thick brown mud. As he struggled to his feet, gasping and dripping, someone in his flight called out, "Nice going, Crash." The name stuck like the mud on his uniform. Within days, even some of the instructors were using it. Marcus tried to laugh it off, to pretend it didn't bother him, but each time he heard it, it felt like another small chip being taken out of his confidence. He started second-guessing himself, hesitating before taking action, which only made him more prone to the kinds of mistakes that had earned him the nickname in the first place. His bunk mate, Jake Morrison, was everything Marcus wasn't. Tall, athletic, confident, Jake had been valedictorian of his high school class and came from a military family. His grandfather had flown bombers over Europe in World War II. His father had been a Navy pilot in Vietnam, and Jake seemed to have inherited their natural grace under pressure. Where Marcus struggled, Jake excelled. Where Marcus stumbled, Jake soared. "Don't let them get to you," Jake would say sometimes, late at night when the bears were quiet, and Marcus lay staring at the ceiling. Basic training isn't about being perfect. It's about not quitting. But Jake's kindness, while genuine, somehow made things worse. Marcus didn't want pity or encouragement. He wanted to earn respect through his performance, and so far, that wasn't happening. Every morning brought new challenges, new opportunities to fall short of expectations. The academic portion of training was where Marcus first began to show glimpses of his potential. While he struggled with the physical demands and military protocols, his mind seemed perfectly suited for the complex systems and procedures they were learning. Aviation theory, weather patterns, navigation principles, aircraft systems. Marcus absorbed it all like a sponge. He could explain the physics of lift and thrust with clarity that impressed even the instructors, could calculate fuel consumption and flight times in his head faster than most recruits could do it with a calculator. But academic excellence meant little if you couldn't perform under pressure, and pressure was something Marcus seemed to wilt under rather than thrive in. During simulated emergency procedures, he would freeze up just long enough to earn disapproving looks from instructors. His hands would shake slightly during equipment checks, causing him to fumble with straps and connections that other recruits handled smoothly. The worst incident came during their first altitude chamber training. The exercise was designed to show recruits what hypoxia felt like, how quickly oxygen deprivation could impair judgment and motor function. One by one, they were taken into a chamber that simulated the atmosphere at 25,000 feet and asked to perform simple tasks as the oxygen was gradually reduced. Marcus had prepared extensively for this exercise, studying the symptoms of hypoxia, reviewing the procedures, visualizing success. But when his turn came, something went wrong. As the oxygen levels dropped, instead of the gradual impairment the others had experienced, Marcus seemed to panic. His breathing became rapid and shallow, his hands shook uncontrollably, and he began hyperventilating. The instructor had to abort the exercise and get him on emergency oxygen. As Marcus sat in the medical bay afterward, oxygen mask over his face, and a flight surgeon checking his vital signs, he could hear the whispers from the other recruits waiting outside. Maybe flying isn't for everyone. Some people just don't have what it takes. Poor guy should probably wash out now before it gets worse. The flight surgeon, a kind woman in her 40s named Dr. Chun, sat down beside Marcus after completing her examination. "Physically, you're fine," she told him. What happened in there was a panic response, not a physiological reaction to hypoxia. It can happen to anyone. But it didn't happen to anyone, Marcus replied, his voice muffled by the oxygen mask. "It happened to me. Again. Dr. Chun studied him for a moment. "You know, I've been doing this for 15 years. I've seen thousands of recruits come through here. The ones who wash out usually fall into two categories. Those who don't care enough to push through when things get difficult, and those who care so much that they get in their own heads and defeat themselves." She paused, making a note on his chart. "You strike me as the second type. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" That night, Marcus lay awake thinking about Dr. Chen's words. He thought about his parents, who had worked extra shifts to help him buy the bus ticket to Nevada. He thought about his little sister, Sophia, who had made him a good luck charm out of braided string and told him she was going to tell everyone at school that her brother was going to be a pilot. He thought about all the people who had said he wasn't cut out for this, and he realized something important. He was proving them right. The next morning, Marcus made a decision. Instead of joining the other recruits for breakfast, he went to the base library and checked out every book they had on aviation psychology, performance under pressure, and managing stress. If his mind was his enemy, he was going to learn how to make it his ally. He started small, with breathing exercises and visualization techniques. Before every physical training session, he would spend 5 minutes in a quiet corner, eyes closed, imagining himself completing each exercise perfectly. Before equipment checks, he would visualize his hands moving smoothly and confidently through each step. It felt silly at first, but slowly, imperceptibly, things began to improve. His push-ups became more controlled, his marching more precise. During obstacle course runs, he started finishing in the middle of the pack instead of dead last. The change was gradual enough that most people didn't notice, but Marcus felt it. The constant anxiety that had been his companion for weeks began to ease slightly. The real test came 3 weeks later during their second altitude chamber exercise. This time, Marcus was prepared not just academically but mentally. As they suited up, he used the breathing techniques he'd learned to keep his heart rate steady. As the chamber door sealed, he reminded himself that he belonged here, that thousands of pilots before him had passed this same test. When his turn came, Marcus entered the chamber with quiet confidence. As the oxygen levels dropped, he felt the familiar symptoms beginning: slight dizziness, a feeling of euphoria, the beginnings of impaired motor function. But instead of panicking, he observed these changes with detached interest, completing his assigned tasks methodically and accurately until the exercise was complete. When he emerged from the chamber, Sergeant Mills was waiting with his clipboard and stopwatch. The gruff instructor looked at his notes, then at Marcus, then back at his notes. Clean run, Rodriguez. Textbook performance. It was the first time an instructor had praised him without qualification or sarcasm. Marcus felt something shift inside him, a small but important change in how he saw himself. Maybe he wasn't the strongest or the fastest or the most naturally gifted recruit in his flight. But maybe, just maybe, he had something else that was just as valuable. As the weeks of basic training continued, Marcus continued to improve steadily. He never became the star recruit. That honor still belonged to Jake Morrison and a few others who seemed to excel effortlessly. But he stopped being the one everyone expected to fail. The nickname Crash faded into occasional use, and then disappeared entirely. He was just Rodriguez again, another face in the flight, working hard and making progress. The transformation wasn't lost on his fellow recruits. Jake Morrison, who had watched Marcus's struggle with genuine concern, noticed the change first. "You're different," he told Marcus one evening as they cleaned their gear. "More focused. More, I don't know, present, I guess." Marcus considered this observation. "I think I was trying so hard not to fail that I forgot to focus on succeeding," he said. They're not the same thing. As graduation from basic training approached, Marcus found himself cautiously optimistic about the next phase of his journey. He had survived the crucible that had broken other recruits. He had learned not just military discipline and basic aviation knowledge, but something more important: how to control his mind under pressure. The night before graduation, he called home to talk to his family. His parents were proud, but still worried about the challenges ahead. His sister Sophia, now a year older but still full of enthusiasm, peppered him with questions about when he would start flying real airplanes. "Soon," Marcus told her, surprising himself with the confidence in his voice. "Very soon." As he hung up the phone and prepared for lights out, Marcus reflected on how much had changed since that first morning outside the base gates. The scared, uncertain 19-year-old who had carried his dreams in a duffel bag was still there, but he was stronger now, more resilient. The failures and humiliations of the past months hadn't broken him. They had forged him into something tougher. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Flight school would be even more demanding than basic training, with higher stakes and less tolerance for error. But Marcus no longer felt like he was fighting the system or proving himself to skeptics. He was simply pursuing his purpose, one step at a time, with the quiet determination of someone who had learned that the only opinion that really mattered was his own. The last thing Marcus saw before falling asleep was the small good luck charm Sophia had made him, hanging from the post of his bunk. Tomorrow, he would take the next step toward earning his wings. And, for the first time since arriving at Nellis, he truly believed he would succeed. The T-6 Texan trainer aircraft gleamed in the morning sun at Columbus Air Force Base in Mississippi, its white and orange paint scheme making it look almost cheerful against the backdrop of the flight line. For Marcus Rodriguez, now 3 months past basic training graduation, it represented both opportunity and terror. This would be his first time at the controls of an actual military aircraft, the moment when all his preparation would either prove worthwhile or reveal him as fundamentally unsuited for the skies. Flight school had begun 6 weeks earlier with ground school, an intensive program of classroom instruction that covered everything from aerodynamics and weather theory to emergency procedures and radio communication protocols. Marcus had excelled in this phase, his natural aptitude for technical subjects allowing him to absorb complex information quickly and thoroughly. But everyone knew that academic success meant nothing if you couldn't actually fly the airplane. His instructor pilot was Captain Sarah Viper Thompson, a former F-16 pilot who had transitioned to training duties after a back injury ended her combat flying career. Viper had a reputation for being tough, but fair, someone who would push students to their limits while keeping them safe. She was also known for her ability to spot potential in unlikely places, which made Marcus both hopeful and nervous about working with her. Flying isn't about being perfect, Viper had told his class during their first meeting. It's about making good decisions quickly, learning from mistakes, and never, ever giving up. Some of you will wash out not because you lack talent, but because you lack persistence. The airplane doesn't care about your ego or your fears. It only responds to competent, confident control inputs. Marcus had taken those words to heart during the weeks of preparation leading up to his first flight. He had studied the T-SIXS systems manual until he could recite emergency procedures from memory. He had spent hours in the flight simulator, practicing basic maneuvers until his muscle memory began to develop. He had visualized successful flights so many times that climbing into the cockpit felt familiar, even though he'd never done it before. But simulation and reality, Marcus discovered, were entirely different experiences. The cockpit of the T-6 was cramped and overwhelming, filled with switches, gauges, and displays that seemed to demand constant attention. The noise was incredible. The turboprop engine's roar combined with wind noise and radio chatter to create a cacophony that made concentration difficult. And then there was the motion, the constant vibration, and movement that reminded him with every second that he was suspended in space with only his skill and the machine's reliability keeping him alive. Take the stick, Viper commanded from the rear seat as they climbed through 3,000 feet on Marcus's first training flight. Feel how the airplane responds. Don't fight it, work with it. Marcus placed his hands on the flight controls with the reverence of someone handling something sacred and terrifying. The stick felt alive in his grip, transmitting every subtle change in airflow and engine power through vibrations and pressure changes. When he made a small input to the right, the airplane rolled gently in that direction. When he pulled back slightly, the nose rose and their climb rate increased. For the first few minutes, it was magical. Marcus felt like he was finally where he belonged, connected to the machine and the sky in a way that seemed natural and right. But then Viper began calling out maneuvers for him to perform, and the magic turned into struggle. Steep turns to the left. Hold your altitude, Viper instructed. Bank 45 degrees and maintained 3,000 feet. Marcus rolled into the turn, but immediately began losing altitude as the increased bank angle reduced his lift. He pulled back on the stick to compensate, but pulled too hard, causing the airplane to climb and lose airspeed. As he tried to correct, the aircraft began to wobble and oscillate, his control inputs becoming increasingly frantic and counterproductive. A heavy aircraft, Viper announced, taking control before Marcus could get them into real trouble. Let's try that again. Remember, smooth inputs. The airplane wants to fly straight and level. Don't fight it, guide it. They spent the rest of the flight working on basic maneuvers, with Marcus showing flashes of competence mixed with moments of confusion and over-control. By the time they landed, He was exhausted and discouraged. Other students in his class seemed to be progressing more smoothly, adapting to the aircraft more naturally. "How did I do?" Marcus asked as they walked back from the flight line, knowing the answer but hoping for encouragement. Viper was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "You're thinking too much up there. Flying isn't an intellectual exercise. It's about developing instincts and trusting them. Right now, you're trying to analyze every input and response instead of just feeling your way through it." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "But I'll tell you something. I've seen natural pilots who wash out because they never learned to work hard, and I've seen strugglers who became excellent aviators because they refused to quit. Which one are you going to be?" That night, Marcus called Jake Morrison, who was going through the same training program, but several weeks ahead in the syllabus. Jake had adapted to flying quickly and was already working on more advanced maneuvers like formation flying and aerobatics. "I feel like I'm fighting the airplane instead of flying it," Marcus confided. "Everything feels forced and jerky." "I went through the same thing," Jake assured him. "The breakthrough comes when you stop trying to control everything and start working with the machine. It's like dancing. You can't force the steps, you have to feel the rhythm." Over the next several weeks, Marcus threw himself into studying and practicing with even greater intensity. He spent extra time in the simulator, working on specific maneuvers until they became more natural. He studied videos of experienced pilots, analyzing their techniques and trying to understand what made their flying look so effortless. Most importantly, he began to relax in the cockpit, focusing less on perfect execution and more on developing feel for the aircraft. Gradually, incrementally, things began to improve. His steep turns became smoother, his altitude control more precise. He started to anticipate the airplane's responses instead of reacting to them after the fact. Viper noticed the change during his 10th training flight when Marcus executed a series of confidence maneuvers with competence that surprised both of them. "Much better," she said over the intercom as Marcus completed a perfect chandelle, a climbing turn that required careful coordination of all flight controls. "You're starting to think like a pilot instead of an engineer." But just as Marcus was beginning to feel confident about his progress, the training program introduced instrument flying, navigating and controlling the aircraft using only the cockpit instruments while wearing a hood that blocked his view outside. This phase of training was where many student pilots failed, unable to adapt to flying without visual references to the horizon and ground. Marcus's first instrument flight was a disaster. Without the ability to see outside the cockpit, he quickly became disoriented and lost control of the aircraft's attitude. What should have been gentle turns became steep spirals, climbs became near stalls, and descents became dangerous dives toward the ground. Viper had to take control multiple times to keep them safe. "You're experiencing spatial disorientation," she explained after they landed. "Your inner ear is telling you one thing, your eyes are telling you another, and your brain doesn't know what to believe. The only solution is to trust your instruments completely, even when they contradict what your body is telling you." Night after night, Marcus practiced instrument procedures on the ground, chair flying through approaches, and holds while staring at instrument panels and procedure charts. He learned to scan the instruments in a systematic pattern, to trust altitude and heading indicators over the false sensations his vestibular system provided. But translating that knowledge into actual flight proved incredibly difficult. His instrument flying struggles became the talk of his class. While other students progressed to more advanced phases of training, Marcus found himself repeating basic instrument flights, trying to master skills that seemed to come naturally to others. The old nickname Crash began to resurface among some of his classmates, whispered behind his back when instructors weren't listening. The breaking point came during his 15th instrument flight, a particularly challenging session that involved flying a complex approach pattern to an unfamiliar airfield. Marcus had prepared extensively, studying the approach charts and procedures until he knew them by heart. But once airborne and under the hood, everything fell apart. He became fixated on one instrument, while others wandered out of acceptable ranges. His altitude control was erratic, his heading wandering. When Viper gave him vectors for the approach, he became confused and turned the wrong direction, putting them dangerously close to terrain. For the third time in the flight, Viper had to take control to avoid a potentially catastrophic situation. After they landed, Viper was unusually quiet during their debriefing. She reviewed Marcus's performance with clinical detachment, noting each error and deviation with the kind of objectivity that suggested she was already writing him off as a lost cause. "Rodriguez," she said finally, "I need to be honest with you. Your instrument flying isn't improving at the rate it needs to. You're behind your classmates, and the program has timelines that have to be met. I'm recommending you for additional training, but if you don't show significant improvement in the next 2 weeks, we'll have to discuss other options." Other options. Marcus knew what that meant. Washing out of pilot training, the end of his dream of flying fighters, reassignment to some other military occupation that would never fulfill the calling he felt in his bones. That night, he sat in his dormitory room staring at the good luck charm Sophia had made him, wondering if he should call home and prepare his family for the disappointment. Instead, he made a different choice. He walked to the base chapel and sat in the quiet darkness, not to pray for divine intervention, but to think clearly about what flying meant to him and what he was willing to sacrifice to achieve it. He thought about all the people who had doubted him, all the times he had been told he wasn't good enough, all the reasons he had been given to quit. Then he thought about the moments when he had felt the magic of flight, the brief instances when everything had clicked and the airplane had responded to his will as naturally as breathing. Those moments proved that he had the potential. He just needed to find a way to unlock it consistently. Over the next week, Marcus attacked instrument flying with a methodical intensity that impressed even his harshest critics. Instead of trying to master everything at once, he broke each procedure down into component parts and practiced them individually until they became automatic. He spent hours in the simulator working on scan patterns, developing the systematic eye movement that allowed pilots to monitor multiple instruments simultaneously. Most importantly, he stopped fighting his disorientation and learned to accept it as a normal part of instrument flying. Instead of becoming frustrated when his body told him he was turning left while the instruments showed straight flight, he acknowledged the sensation and trusted his instruments anyway. The breakthrough came during a routine holding pattern exercise. Marcus was flying a racetrack-shaped pattern over a navigation beacon, something he had struggled with repeatedly in previous flights. But this time, something was different. His scan was smooth and systematic, his corrections small and precise. He found himself anticipating the airplane's tendency to drift in the turns, making subtle adjustments before deviations became significant. "Nice work," Viper said quietly over the intercom. That's what instrument flying is supposed to look like. From that point forward, Marcus's instrument flying improved rapidly. Skills that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier became routine. He flew approaches with precision that met or exceeded standards, handled complex air traffic control clearances without confusion, and demonstrated the kind of systematic thinking that made for safe instrument pilots. 2 weeks later, during his check ride evaluation with a different instructor, Marcus flew one of the most precise instrument approaches the examiner had seen from a student pilot that month. His hood work was smooth and confident, his radio were professional, his decision-making sound. "Well done, Rodriguez," the Czech pilot said as they taxied back to the flight line. "You've earned your instrument rating. You should be proud. A lot of good people wash out right here." That evening, Marcus called home to share the news with his family. His parents were relieved and proud, but it was Sophia's reaction that meant the most to him. "I knew you could do it," his little sister said with absolute conviction. "I never worried about you for even 1 minute." As Marcus prepared for the next phase of his training, formation flying and aerobatics, he reflected on how much he had changed since those early struggles. He was no longer the uncertain young man who had been overwhelmed by every challenge. The repeated failures and small victories had forged something stronger in him, a kind of resilient competence that couldn't be shaken by temporary setbacks. Viper found him on the flight line the next morning, pre-flighting his aircraft for another training mission. "Ready for formation flying?" she asked. Marcus looked up from his inspection of the airplane's control surfaces and smiled. "Absolutely. I think I'm finally starting to understand what it means to be a pilot." Viper nodded approvingly. "The hardest part is behind you now. Everything else is just building on what you've already learned." As Marcus climbed into the cockpit for another day of training, he felt something he hadn't experienced since arriving at flight school: genuine excitement about what lay ahead. The sky no longer seemed like foreign territory to be conquered, but like home territory to be explored. And for the first time since beginning his journey toward wings, he truly believed that nothing could stop him from reaching his destination. The F-16 Fighting Falcon sat on the ramp at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona like a crouched predator, its sleek gray form radiating barely contained power. Marcus Rodriguez, now wearing the silver wings of a qualified pilot on his uniform, approached the aircraft with a mixture of reverence and anticipation that bordered on religious experience. After 18 months of training on progressively more complex aircraft, he was finally about to fly the machine he had dreamed of since childhood, a real fighter jet. The journey from flight school graduation to this moment had been filled with achievements Marcus could barely have imagined during his early struggles. After mastering instrument flying, he had excelled in formation flying, learning to maintain precise position with other aircraft while performing complex maneuvers. His aerobatic training had unlocked a natural feel for the aircraft's capabilities and limitations, teaching him to think in 3 dimensions and react instinctively to changing conditions. But perhaps most importantly, he had discovered something about himself that no instructor could have taught him. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure and make sound decisions when everything was going wrong. This quality had first manifested during an emergency landing exercise when a simulated engine failure in the T-6 had required him to navigate to the nearest suitable airfield while managing a dozen competing priorities. While other students had become flustered and made dangerous mistakes, Marcus had worked through the problem methodically and landed safely with fuel to spare. His instructor that day, Captain Hammer Davidson, had filed a report that became part of Marcus's permanent record. Lieutenant Rodriguez demonstrates exceptional judgment and composure under stress. Recommend immediate advancement to fighter training track. Now, standing beside $15 million worth of cutting-edge military technology, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his circumstances had changed. The scared young man who had earned the nickname Crash seemed like a different person entirely. His classmates from basic training would barely recognize the confident, competent pilot he had become. His new instructor pilot at Luke AFB was Major Razor Williams, a veteran F-16 pilot with over 2,000 hours in the Fighting Falcon and combat experience in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Razor had a reputation for being one of the most demanding IPs in the squadron, someone who would push students to their absolute limits while maintaining the highest safety standards. The F-16 is not like anything you've flown before, Razor had told Marcus's class during their first briefing. It's a high-performance machine that will kill you if you make stupid mistakes, but it will also do things that defy physics if you know how to ask it nicely. Respect the airplane, understand its systems, and it will take you places you never imagined possible. The F-16's cockpit was both more complex and more intuitive than the trainers Marcus had flown. Every switch and display had been designed for combat efficiency, allowing the pilot to manage sophisticated weapon systems while pulling 9 times the force of gravity in a dogfight. The heads-up display projected critical flight information directly onto the windscreen, eliminating the need to look down at instruments during combat maneuvering. But it was the engine that truly set the F-16 apart from everything else. The Pratt & Whitney F-100 afterburning turbofan produced nearly 30,000 pounds of thrust, giving the relatively lightweight fighter an incredible power-to-weight ratio. When the afterburner lit, the airplane transformed from fast jet to rocket ship, capable of accelerating from subsonic to supersonic flight in seconds. Marcus's first F-16 flight was scheduled as a familiarization ride with Razor in the front seat and Marcus observing from the back. As they taxied to the runway, Marcus tried to absorb every detail of the aircraft's behavior. The F-16's fly-by-wire flight control system was constantly making tiny adjustments to maintain stable flight, something that would have required constant pilot input in older aircraft. Tower, Viper 01, ready for departure, Razor called over the radio as they reached the runway threshold. Viper 01, Tower, cleared for takeoff, contact departure on 119.1. Cleared for takeoff, 119.1, Viper 01. Razor advanced the throttle to military power, and the F-16 began rolling down the runway with impressive acceleration. But when he selected afterburner, the aircraft transformed completely. The acceleration became violent, pressing Marcus back into his ejection seat with a force that made breathing difficult. They reached takeoff speed in what seemed like seconds and climbed into the Arizona sky at an angle that defied every law of physics Marcus thought he understood. "Welcome to the Viper," Razor said over the intercom as they leveled off at 20,000 feet. "Everything you've flown before was just preparation for this." Over the next hour, Razor demonstrated the F-16's capabilities in a way that redefined Marcus's understanding of what airplanes could do. They performed rolls and loops at speeds that would have torn apart the trainers Marcus was used to. They climbed to 40,000 feet in minutes, then dove back down to low altitude while pulling G-forces that grayed out the edges of Marcus's vision. Most impressively, Razor showed him basic fighter maneuvers, the aggressive turns, and energy management techniques that form the foundation of air-to-air combat. The F-16 could turn so tightly that it seemed to defy physics, pulling up to 9 Gs while maintaining controlled flight. At those forces, Marcus felt like he weighed over 1,500 pounds, his arms too heavy to lift, his vision tunneling to a tiny circle directly ahead. G-tolerance is something you build gradually, Razor explained as they recovered from a particularly aggressive maneuver. Your body will adapt, but it takes time and practice. Some pilots never develop the ability to handle high G-forces effectively. Others seem born for it. After landing, Marcus was both exhilarated and exhausted. The flight had lasted only an hour, but the physical and mental demands had been unlike anything he'd experienced. Every muscle in his body ached from the G-forces, and his mind was spinning from trying to process the incredible performance he'd witnessed. "How do you feel?" Razor asked as they walked back from the aircraft. "Like I've been hit by a truck," Marcus admitted, "but also like I've seen what I was meant to do with my life." Razor smiled at that response. "Good, because tomorrow you start flying it yourself." Marcus's first solo flight in the F-16 was scheduled for the following week, after intensive ground school covering the aircraft systems, emergency procedures, and basic flying qualities. The night before the flight, he lay awake reviewing procedures and visualizing the mission profile. Unlike his early training days, the nervousness he felt was not about his ability to handle the aircraft, but about living up to the privilege of flying such an incredible machine. The morning of his first F-16 solo dawned clear and calm, perfect conditions for a new pilot's introduction to the fighter. Marcus completed his pre-flight inspection with a thorough attention to detail that had become second nature during his training. Every system check was perfect. Every control surface moved smoothly through its full range of motion. Viper 23, Luke ground control, taxi to runway 21 right, came the controller's voice over the radio. Taxi runway 21 right, Viper 23, Marcus replied, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. As he taxied to the runway, Marcus felt a profound sense of completion, as if every experience of his life had been leading to this moment. The scared recruit who had struggled through basic training, the determined student who had overcome instrument flying challenges, the competent pilot who had earned his wings, they were all part of the person now sitting in the cockpit of one of the world's most advanced fighter aircraft. Viper 23, Tower, cleared for takeoff. Cleared for takeoff. Viper 23. Marcus advanced the throttle to military power and felt the familiar surge of acceleration. But this time he was in control. This time, the decisions were his to make. He selected afterburner, and the F-16 leaped forward like a caged animal suddenly, freed, accelerating down the runway faster than anything Marcus had ever experienced. At rotation speed, he pulled back gently on the stick and felt the aircraft lift off with authority that made previous airplanes seem like toys by comparison. The Arizona desert fell away beneath him as he climbed toward his assigned altitude, every control input producing immediate and precise response from the aircraft. For the next hour, Marcus explored the F-16's flying qualities within the conservative parameters established for new pilots. He performed basic maneuvers, turns, climbs, descents, speed changes, but even these simple exercises reveal the aircraft's incredible capabilities. The F-16 responded to his commands with a precision and authority that made him feel like he could write his name across the sky. The highlight of the flight came when he was cleared to perform his first afterburner climb. Marcus advanced the throttle past the military power stop and into the afterburner range, feeling the dramatic increase in thrust as the jet's exhaust nozzle opened and raw fuel was injected into the engine's exhaust stream. The acceleration was overwhelming, pressing him back into his seat as the aircraft climbed at angles that seemed impossible. "This is what I was born to do," Marcus said aloud to himself as the F-16 rocketed through 30,000 feet with no sign of diminishing performance. When it came time to return to base, Marcus felt genuinely reluctant to end the flight. Landing the F-16 required precise speed and glide path control, but after months of training in less forgiving aircraft, the Fighting Falcon's approach characteristics felt manageable and predictable. As he taxied back to the ramp and shut down the engine, Marcus sat quietly in the cockpit for several minutes, absorbing the magnitude of what he had just accomplished. He had successfully soloed in an F-16 Fighting Falcon, something that only a tiny percentage of military pilots ever achieved. Razor was waiting by the aircraft when Marcus climbed down from the cockpit. "How was it?" the instructor asked. "Perfect," Marcus replied without hesitation. "Absolutely perfect." Over the next several months, Marcus progressed through increasingly complex F-16 training missions. He learned air-to-air combat maneuvers, practicing dogfighting techniques against other student pilots. He mastered air-to-ground attacks, delivering practice bombs and missiles against targets in the Arizona desert with growing precision and confidence. But it was during the advanced tactical training phase that Marcus truly distinguished himself. While many pilots could execute individual maneuvers competently, Marcus demonstrated an ability to think several steps ahead, anticipating his opponent's moves and positioning himself for advantage in complex tactical scenarios. His situational awareness was exceptional. He could track multiple aircraft while managing his own energy state and weapon systems, making split-second decisions that often determine the outcome of training engagements. Instructors began to notice that Marcus rarely made the same mistake twice, learning from each exercise and incorporating new knowledge into his tactical repertoire. The defining moment came during a complex air-to-air exercise involving 8 aircraft in a realistic combat scenario. Marcus was flying as wingman to an experienced instructor when they were engaged by 4 opposing aircraft in what should have been an overwhelming disadvantage. Through a combination of aggressive maneuvering, superior energy management, and tactical creativity, Marcus and his flight leader managed to defeat all 4 opponents without suffering a single simulated loss. "I've never seen a student pilot handle a tactical situation that complex," the exercise controller told Marcus during the debrief. "You were thinking like a weapons school graduate out there." As his F-16 training neared completion, Marcus reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him to this point. The transformation from struggling recruit to confident fighter pilot seemed almost impossible to believe, but Every challenge overcome had built the foundation for the next level of achievement. His final check ride was scheduled with the squadron commander, Colonel Shark Peterson, a legendary pilot with combat experience spanning 3 decades. The ride would test everything Marcus had learned over the past year, from basic aircraft handling to complex tactical scenarios. "This is your chance to show me what kind of pilot you're going to be," Colonel Peterson told him before the flight. "I'm not looking for perfection. I'm looking for someone who can handle the unexpected and make good decisions under pressure." The check ride was challenging but manageable, testing Marcus's skills across the full spectrum of F-16 capabilities. He performed air-to-air intercepts, air-to-ground attacks, and emergency procedures with a confidence and competence that had become his trademark. When an unexpected weather system forced them to divert to an alternate airfield, Marcus handled the situation smoothly and professionally. After landing, Colonel Peterson was quiet during their walk back from the aircraft. Marcus knew that his performance had been solid, but he couldn't read the squadron commander's expression. "Congratulations, Lieutenant Rodriguez," Peterson said finally. "You've earned your F-16 qualification. More importantly, you've earned the right to call yourself a fighter pilot." That evening, Marcus called home to share the news with his family. His parents were proud, but still somewhat amazed that their son had achieved something that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Sophia, now in middle school, but still his biggest supporter, was beside herself with excitement. "When are you going to fly the really fast ones?" she asked, referring to the more advanced fighters she'd seen in movies. "This is pretty fast already," Marcus laughed. "But who knows what the future holds?" As he prepared for his assignment to his first operational squadron, Marcus thought about the long journey from that first morning outside the gates of Nellis Air Force Base to this moment of triumph. Every setback had made him stronger. Every challenge had revealed new reserves of determination and capability. The young man who had been called Crash was gone forever, replaced by a pilot who had earned the respect of his instructors and peers through demonstrated competence under pressure. Soon, he would receive his tactical call sign, the name by which he would be known throughout his fighter pilot career. He had no way of knowing that in just a few short years, that call sign would become legendary throughout the Air Force, associated with one of the most remarkable missions in modern aviation history. For now, he was simply Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez, newly qualified F-16 pilot, ready to serve his country in whatever capacity his skills might require. The sky had been his dream since childhood. Now was his domain. The 421st Fighter Squadron at Hill Air Force Base in Utah buzzed with the controlled chaos of a combat-ready F-16 unit preparing for deployment. Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez had been assigned to the Black Widows fresh out of training, and the reality of operational flying was proving to be vastly different from the structured environment of pilot school. Here, every mission carried real-world implications. Every decision could affect national security, and the margin for error was measured in lives rather than training grades. Marcus had arrived at Hill 6 months earlier, carrying his F-16 qualification and a training record that marked him as a promising new pilot. But operational squadrons had their own way of evaluating newcomers, and academic achievement meant little compared to performance under the pressures of real-world flying. The squadron's mission included both air-to-air defense and precision ground attack, requiring pilots to master multiple skill sets while maintaining the highest levels of proficiency. His new squadron mates had given him the call sign Ghost during his first month with the unit, a reference to his uncanny ability to appear in unexpected places during training dogfights, and his tendency to operate with quiet confidence rather than the aggressive bravado some pilots displayed. The name stuck, and Marcus found he liked it better than his own given name. Ghost represented who he had become, a competent professional who let his flying do his talking. The squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hammer Jackson, was a veteran of multiple combat deployments who expected nothing less than excellence from his pilots. During Ghost's first squadron meeting, Jackson had made the unit's standards clear: we fly, fight, and win. Everything else is secondary. I don't care if you're number one in your training class or if you barely graduated. What matters is what you do here now when it counts. Ghost's first few months with the Black Widows have been a period of intense learning and adaptation. The squadron's training scenarios were more complex and realistic than anything he'd experienced in pilot school. They practiced large force exercises involving dozens of aircraft, simulated combat against sophisticated threats, and conducted precision strikes against targets that required split-second timing and perfect execution. But it was during night flying operations that Ghost truly began to distinguish himself. Night combat flying was among the most demanding skills a fighter pilot could master, requiring the ability to navigate, fight, and make tactical decisions while operating in complete darkness with only instruments and night vision equipment for reference. Many pilots never became comfortable with night operations, limiting their effectiveness in real-world scenarios. Ghost, however, seemed to thrive in the darkness. His instrument flying skills, hard-won during those difficult months in training, translated perfectly to night combat operations. He could maintain precise formation position in pitch-black conditions, navigate complex routes using only electronic displays, and execute weapons deliveries with accuracy that impressed even veteran pilots. "That kid has night vision better than the equipment," observed Captain Viper Chun, the squadron's weapons officer, after a particularly challenging night training mission. "I've never seen a new pilot adapt to night ops that quickly." The comment reached Lieutenant Colonel Jackson, who began paying closer attention to Ghost's performance. The squadron commander had been flying fighters for 15 years and had developed an eye for identifying pilots with special capabilities. Ghost's combination of technical skill, tactical awareness, and unflappable demeanor under pressure marked him as someone with exceptional potential. The opportunity to prove that potential came sooner than anyone expected. In March of Ghost's first year with the squadron, tensions in the Middle East escalated rapidly following a series of terrorist attacks on American installations. The 421st Fighter Squadron received deployment orders with just 72 hours' notice, tasking them to establish air superiority over a region where enemy forces possess sophisticated surface-to-air missile systems and modern fighter aircraft. Ghost had never deployed before, but the veteran pilots around him moved with the practiced efficiency of professionals who had done this many times. Within hours, aircraft were being configured for combat, weapons loaded, and mission planning conducted around the clock. The stakes were real now. Instead of practice targets and simulated threats, they would be facing an enemy that would be doing everything possible to kill them. The deployment to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar put the squadron in the heart of ongoing combat operations. From their first day in theater, they were flying real missions over hostile territory, providing close air support for ground forces, and conducting strategic strikes against high-value targets. The pace was relentless, sometimes 2 or 3 missions per day in the demanding environment of the Middle Eastern desert. Ghost's first combat mission was scheduled as a close air support flight over northern Iraq, where Army Special Forces units were engaged with enemy fighters in mountainous terrain that made traditional artillery support impossible. Ghost would be flying as wingman to Major Spike Rodriguez, an experienced combat pilot who had flown over 100 combat missions. "Stay close, follow my lead, and remember that people on the ground are counting on us," Spike briefed Ghost before the mission. "This isn't training anymore. What we do up there determines whether good guys go home to their families tonight." The flight to the target area took them over some of the most hostile airspace in the world, where enemy surface-to-air missile systems posed a constant threat to coalition aircraft. Ghost monitored his radar warning receiver constantly, watching for the electronic signatures that would indicate missile systems were tracking them. The tension was unlike anything he'd experienced in training. Every moment carried the possibility of sudden, violent death. When they reached the target area, the ground controller's voice crackled over the radio with urgency that made Ghost's blood run cold. "Gunfighter 21, this is Ranger 6. We are taking heavy fire from enemy positions on the ridge line. Grid 38 SMB 12345. 67890. Request immediate fire mission. Danger close. Danger close. That meant friendly forces were so close to the target that any error in weapons delivery could result in fratricide, killing the very people they were trying to help. The margin for error was measured in meters, requiring precision that demanded perfect execution under extreme pressure. Ranger 6, Gunfighter 21, copy danger close, Spike replied. Stand by for laser designation. Ghost watched as Spike's aircraft began its attack run, diving toward the target at an angle that would allow precise delivery of guided munitions. The enemy positions were clearly visible on their targeting pods, muzzle flashes from automatic weapons creating a deadly light show in the darkness below. Ghost, you're cleared hot. Follow my attack heading, Spike commanded as he pulled off target after delivering his weapons. Ghost rolled his F-16 into the attack dive, feeling the familiar sensation of G-forces pressing him into his seat as the aircraft accelerated toward the ground. Through his heads-up display, he could see the laser designation marking the exact spot where his weapons needed to impact. The targeting solution was perfect, but the proximity of friendly forces made this one of the most challenging shots of his young career. He released his weapons at the precise moment dictated by his fire control computer and pulled up sharply, feeling the aircraft strain under the high G recovery as he climbed away from the target area. Behind him, the night sky lit up with secondary explosions as his guided bombs found their mark with devastating accuracy. Ranger 6, Gunfighter 21, how copy? Spike called to the ground controller. Gunfighter 21, Ranger 6, direct hit. Enemy fire has ceased. Outstanding work up there. As they flew back to base, Ghost reflected on the magnitude of what had just happened. He had delivered weapons in combat for the first time, successfully completing a danger-close mission that had quite literally saved American lives. The responsibility was sobering, but also deeply satisfying in a way that no training exercise could replicate. Nice work tonight, Spike told him as they shut down their engines back at Al-Udeid. That was textbook weapons delivery under pressure. You've got what it takes for this job. Over the next several months, Ghost flew mission after mission over hostile territory, building experience and reputation with each flight. He conducted strategic strikes against enemy command facilities, provided close air support for ground operations, and flew combat air patrol missions protecting coalition assets from enemy aircraft. His night flying skills made him particularly valuable for the most challenging missions, those conducted in darkness against the most heavily defended targets. But it was during a routine patrol mission in late September that Ghost encountered the situation that would define his career and earn him a place in Air Force legend. He was flying a solo combat air patrol over the Syrian desert when his radar detected an unusual contact that didn't match any known friendly aircraft signature. AWACS, Ghost 72, contact bearing 285, range 40 miles, unknown classification. He reported to the Airborne Command and Control aircraft coordinating the mission. Ghost 72, AWACS, continue to monitor no known friendlies in that area. As Ghost maneuvered closer to investigate, his radar warning receiver began indicating that he was being tracked by an enemy fire control radar. The contact was not just unknown, it was hostile, and it was positioning for an attack. But something about the electronic signature didn't match any known enemy aircraft in the theater. AWACS, Ghost 72, I'm being painted by fire control radar from the unknown contact. Request permission to investigate. Ghost 72, AWACS, cleared to investigate. Maintain altitude separation. Ghost activated his aircraft's passive sensors, gathering electronic intelligence about the mysterious contact while maintaining a safe distance. What he discovered sent a chill down his spine. The aircraft he was tracking was far more advanced than anything enemy forces were supposed to possess in the region. The radar signature and electronic emissions suggested a stealth fighter, possibly Russian or Chinese technology that hadn't been seen in combat before. This changes everything, Ghost muttered to himself as he continued to gather intelligence on the unknown aircraft. The hostile aircraft was operating in a pattern that suggested it was conducting reconnaissance on coalition air bases and supply routes, gathering intelligence that could be used to plan devastating attacks on American forces. If this aircraft returned to base with that information, hundreds of lives could be at risk. But engaging the unknown aircraft would mean entering combat against a potentially superior enemy in a solo fight where backup was 30 minutes away. The smart tactical decision would be to maintain contact while calling for reinforcement. The safe decision would be to withdraw and report what he'd observed. Ghost had perhaps 30 seconds to make a choice that could determine the outcome of ongoing military operations. As he watched the hostile aircraft continue its intelligence-gathering mission, he realized that this was the moment he'd been preparing for his entire career. All the training, all the setbacks, and small victories, all the nights spent studying and practicing, everything had led to this decision point in hostile airspace over the Syrian desert. The unknown aircraft was beginning to turn toward home, carrying intelligence that could cost American lives. Ghost armed his weapons systems and began closing the distance, accepting the risk of solo combat against an unknown enemy because the mission required it, and because he knew, with absolute certainty, that he possessed the skills to succeed. AWACS, Ghost 72, going engaged with hostile aircraft. Standby for tactical. What happened next would become the subject of classified briefings at the highest levels of the Pentagon, and earned Ghost recognition as one of the most capable combat pilots of his generation. But in that moment, alone in the darkness over enemy territory, he was simply doing what he'd been trained to do, making the hard decisions that protected American forces and advanced the mission. The scared recruit who had struggled through basic training was gone forever, replaced by a warrior who had found his calling in the unforgiving environment of air-to-air combat. The next few minutes would prove that sometimes the person everyone underestimated becomes exactly the hero the moment demands. In the vast darkness of the Middle Eastern night, Ghost prepared to engage an enemy that represented everything he'd trained to defeat. The outcome would depend entirely on skill, tactics, and the kind of calm determination that couldn't be taught but had to be forged through adversity and proven under fire. The legend of Ghost was about to be born. The hostile aircraft Ghost was tracking represented technology that intelligence analysts had theorized about, but never confirmed in combat. As he closed to engagement range, his radar finally achieved a solid lock on the target, revealing performance characteristics that exceeded anything currently in the American inventory. The aircraft was capable of supersonic flight without afterburner, possessed advanced stealth characteristics that made radar tracking difficult, and carried weapon systems that could engage targets at extreme range. But Ghost had advantages that no amount of advanced technology could overcome. He had been trained in adversary tactics by pilots who understood how to exploit the weaknesses inherent in any weapon system. He possessed an intuitive understanding of energy management and tactical geometry that allowed him to position his aircraft for maximum advantage. Most importantly, he had developed the kind of tactical creativity that turned disadvantages into opportunities. Ghost 72, AWACS, were showing your target maneuvering aggressively. Recommend you maintain separation until reinforcements arrive. AWACS, Ghost 72, negative on separation. Target is collecting intelligence on our operating locations. If I let this guy go, people die. The hostile aircraft had detected Ghost's approach and was beginning evasive maneuvers that demonstrated its pilot was highly skilled and familiar with American fighter tactics. Instead of attempting to flee the area, the enemy pilot was positioning for combat, confident that his aircraft's superior technology would give him decisive advantage in a one-on-one engagement. Ghost watched his radar display as the hostile aircraft turned toward him, accelerating to supersonic speed while climbing to gain energy advantage. It was a textbook tactical setup. Use superior performance to gain position, then employ advanced weapons to eliminate the threat before it could respond effectively. The enemy pilot was following standard doctrine for engaging inferior aircraft. But Ghost had spent months studying exactly this type of engagement scenario during his weapons school training. He understood that technological superiority meant nothing if the superior aircraft could be drawn into a type of fight where pilot skill became the determining factor. Instead of trying to match the hostile aircraft's climb rate and speed, Ghost did something unexpected. He descended toward the desert floor while reducing his throttle setting. To any observer, it would have appeared that Ghost was attempting to flee the engagement, using terrain masking to break radar contact while running for friendly airspace. The hostile aircraft's pilot apparently reached the same conclusion, diving to pursue what appeared to be a retreating enemy fighter. But Ghost wasn't running. He was setting a trap. As the hostile aircraft descended in pursuit, Ghost used the terrain to mask his own maneuvers while positioning for a head-on engagement that would neutralize the enemy's speed and altitude advantages. The F-16's smaller radar signature and superior maneuverability at lower altitudes would give Ghost the tactical edge he needed to succeed against a technologically superior opponent. The engagement developed with stunning speed. At a combined closure rate exceeding 1,500 miles per hour, the two aircraft rapidly converged on a collision course that would be resolved in seconds rather than minutes. Ghost armed his weapons systems while maintaining radar lock on the hostile aircraft, waiting for the precise moment when his missiles would have the highest probability of kill. AWACS, Ghost 72, Fox 2, Fox 2, Ghost called as he released two heat-seeking missiles at the maximum effective range for a head-on engagement. The hostile aircraft's pilot responded immediately, deploying defensive countermeasures while maneuvering violently to defeat the incoming missiles. Brilliant flares streamed from the aircraft as it pulled into a climb that would have caused most pilots to lose consciousness from the extreme G-forces involved. Ghost's first missile was successfully decoyed by the countermeasures, but his second missile maintained lock despite the enemy's defensive maneuvers. As he watched the missile guide toward its target, Ghost was already maneuvering for a follow-up attack, anticipating that the hostile aircraft would survive the initial engagement. The missile impact was spectacular, but not immediately lethal. The advanced aircraft absorbed the hit while continuing to maneuver, though its pilot was now clearly focused on survival rather than intelligence collection. Ghost pressed his attack, using the F-16's superior turning ability to maintain position for another weapons release. What followed was 3 minutes of the most intense air-to-air combat Ghost had ever experienced. The two aircraft maneuvered violently through 3 dimensions, each pilot using every tactical technique in his arsenal while trying to gain the split-second advantage that would determine survival. G-forces pressed Ghost to the edge of consciousness repeatedly as he pulled the F-16 through turns that stressed both aircraft and pilot to their absolute limits. The hostile aircraft's pilot was exceptional, demonstrating tactical knowledge and flying skill that marked him as an elite aviator. But the damaged aircraft was bleeding energy and altitude with each maneuver, gradually losing the performance advantage that had made it so dangerous. Ghost recognized the moment when the tactical balance shifted in his favor. The hostile aircraft was no longer maneuvering aggressively, but was attempting to disengage from combat, probably trying to reach sanctuary in non-coalition airspace where it could land and undergo repairs. Not today, Ghost muttered as he positioned for a final attack. His third missile launch came from an optimal position, close range, high angle off, with the target aircraft countermeasures largely expended from previous engagements. The missile guided flawlessly to impact, causing catastrophic damage that sent the hostile aircraft spinning toward the desert floor in flames. AWACS, Ghost 72, Splash 1 hostile aircraft, Grid 38 SMB 4567891234. Pilot ejection observed. The airspace around the crash site erupted with activity as rescue aircraft scrambled to recover the downed pilot before enemy ground forces could reach him. The intelligence value of capturing the pilot of such an advanced aircraft was immense, potentially revealing capabilities and intentions that could influence American strategy throughout the region. Ghost maintained combat air patrol over the crash site until rescue forces arrived, then escorted the recovery helicopters back to friendly airspace. Only after landing at Al-Udeid did the magnitude of what he'd accomplished begin to sink in. He had successfully engaged and destroyed an aircraft that represented the most advanced threat American forces had encountered in the theater. The debrief was conducted by officials at classification levels far above Ghost clearance, with representatives from multiple intelligence agencies participating via secure video link. The electronic intelligence Ghost had gathered during the engagement provided crucial insights into adversary capabilities, while his tactical success demonstrated that American pilots could successfully engage even the most advanced threats when properly trained and equipped. What you did out there tonight probably saved hundreds of American lives, Lieutenant Colonel Jackson told Ghost after the classified portions of the debrief were complete. That aircraft was mapping our entire defensive network. If it had made it home with that intelligence, we'd be facing coordinated attacks that could have been devastating. But the true recognition came 3 weeks later, when Ghost received a personal phone call from the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. The nation's highest-ranking airman had called to personally congratulate him on what was being described as one of the most significant air-to-air victories of the modern era. Lieutenant Rodriguez, the general said, "You've demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical excellence and moral courage that defines our service. Your actions reflect credit upon yourself, your unit, and the entire United States Air Force." The mission that had started as a routine patrol had become a defining moment, not just for Ghost's career, but for American air superiority doctrine. The tactics he'd employed were studied at the highest levels of military education, providing insights that would influence pilot training for years to come. When Ghost's deployment ended 6 months later, he returned to Hill Air Force Base with a distinguished flying cross and a reputation that preceded him throughout the fighter community. The young man who had struggled through basic training was now recognized as one of the most capable combat pilots of his generation. His homecoming was quiet but meaningful. His parents, who had never fully understood their son's military career, finally grasped the significance of what he'd accomplished when they saw news coverage of his decoration ceremony. Sophia, now a high school senior planning her own future, looked at her brother with a mixture of pride and amazement. "Remember when everyone said you'd never make it as a pilot?" she asked him during his visit home. Ghost smiled at the memory of those early struggles. Sometimes the best thing about being underestimated is the opportunity to prove everyone wrong. Back at Hill Air Force Base, Ghost was assigned to the squadron's weapons officer position, responsible for training the next generation of fighter pilots. The role allowed him to pass on the tactical knowledge and mental toughness he developed through years of training and combat experience. During his first lecture to new squadron pilots, Ghost shared the lesson that had sustained him through every challenge. Flying fighters isn't about being naturally gifted or having perfect scores in training. It's about making good decisions under pressure and never, ever giving up. The airplane doesn't care about your background or your test scores. It only responds to competent, confident control inputs. One young lieutenant in the audience reminded Ghost of himself years earlier. Uncertain, struggling with confidence, clearly talented, but not yet believing in that talent. After the lecture, Ghost approached the young pilot. "How are you adapting to the squadron?" Ghost asked. "It's challenging, sir. Sometimes I wonder if I belong here." Ghost nodded with understanding. "I felt the same way when I started. The secret is to focus on improvement rather than perfection. Every flight is an opportunity to get better." The young lieutenant looked skeptical. "Did you ever feel like quitting?" "Every day for the first 6 months," Ghost admitted. "But I had something to prove to myself more than anyone else. Find your motivation and hold on to it, especially during the difficult times." As the lieutenant walked away, Ghost reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The scared recruit who had earned the nickname Crash seemed like a character from someone else's story. The transformation had been gradual, but complete, forged through thousands of hours of training, combat experience that tested every skill he'd learned, and the kind of self-discovery that only came through facing seemingly impossible challenges. His radio call sign Ghost had taken on legendary status throughout the fighter community, associated with tactical excellence and the kind of combat success that defined careers. But for Marcus Rodriguez, it represented something more personal, proof that determination could overcome any disadvantage, that character could be more important than natural ability, and that sometimes the person everyone counts out becomes exactly the hero the moment demands. The morning sun painted the Utah mountains in shades of gold as Ghost prepared for another training mission with his squadron. As he walked toward his F-16, he thought about the young pilots he was helping to train, each carrying their own dreams and insecurities, each facing the same challenges that had once seemed overwhelming to him. In a few hours, he would be back in the sky where he belonged, passing on the skills and knowledge that had been entrusted to him by the instructors who had believed in his potential even when he didn't believe in himself. The circle was complete, but the mission continued. The scared young man who had stood outside the gates of Nellis Air Force Base years earlier had found his calling and exceeded even his own dreams of what was possible. Every challenge overcome had built the foundation for greater achievements. Every failure had taught lessons that contributed to future success. As Ghost climbed into the cockpit of his F-16 and began pre-flight checks, he smiled at the memory of that first instructor who had told him that flying wasn't about being perfect, it was about not quitting. The lesson had proven true beyond anything he could have imagined, carrying him from the depths of self-doubt to the pinnacle of professional achievement. The sky was calling again, as it had every day since he'd first dreamed of flying. But now it was no longer a distant goal. It was home territory, a place where Lieutenant Marcus Ghost Rodriguez had earned the right to belong through skill, courage, and the kind of stubborn determination that turned impossible dreams into legendary reality. In the end, everyone had laughed at him and his unlikely call sign, until that voice crackled over the radio, "Eagle-7, your go for launch." Then, the laughter stopped, and the legend began.